The modern timeline of Five Nights at Freddy's is a drastic battle between two opposing forces. On one side, the side we've known, is Glitchtrap, or Malhair, a variant of the Mimic that William Afton personally trained on himself to continue his legacy should his flesh ever fail him. The other side, M1, or Fiona, is the original Mimic trained on the late wife of its inventor, Edwin Murray, now with only one goal: bringing her son back. Both sides are desperately vying for control over the Mimic, an endoskeleton trapped in a pizzeria underneath the Mega Pizzaplex. But what does the Mimic want? Slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. So what is that thing in the basement of the Pizzaplex? The Mimic is an interesting character, especially by this time of Ruin. It's an endoskeleton that we've never seen before, and it frankly looks like it's made up of several other endoskeletons. The parts are all mismatched. It's very clearly acting like a variant of the original Mimic schematics, but if so, which one is it? And is this endoskeleton somehow the old one? Well, as we get into it, let me briefly go over the theory that sets the stage for this entire video. Oh, this is a little more medieval fantasy than I was expecting, but I do love medieval fantasy, so I'm not complaining. Although I hope it's more medieval and less fantasy. I don't want to have to worry about skeletons or something. Wait a minute. A sponsor. Perfect. Today's video is brought to you by Fume. Nice. When I walk through a dungeon, I always turn left even though it's not really a maze. Some habits are harmless, but for others, well, Fume makes it easier to swap out. Straight away, Fume is not a vape or e-cig or anything like that. There's no smoke, no vapor, no nicotine. Just natural, flavored air that gives you something to reach for without the chemicals. You just take one of their essential oil-infused cores and place it in the magnetically locking device. And you draw through the flavor. But my favorite part of Fume is that it is built to fidget with. It makes a clicking sound as you adjust, has a magnetically locking frame, and Fume offers silicone toppers. So if you're like me with an oil fixation, it gives you something to chew on. Over 500,000 people have already added Fume to their daily routine. And I totally get why. It's simple, satisfying, and doesn't come with any of the downsides of smoking or vaping. And right now, if you order the Journey Pack with my code RYTOAST, you'll get a free Fume topper. So if you've been thinking about changing your habits, this is the perfect first step. Go to tryfume.com/RYTOAST or scan the QR code on screen to grab yours today. Thanks again to Fume for sponsoring today's video. Okay, maybe I'm gonna have to worry about skeletons. MimicCustody, or rather Springer Trap, is the theory I posited last week. It's the idea I opened this video with. If you want all of its details and arguments, you can watch last week's video right here, but very briefly, let me touch on the essentials connecting the two games, as they're very important for today's theory. M1 is the original variant of the Mimic schematics. It was trained on Fiona Murray, a puppeteer who was the wife of Edwin and mother of David. After she died during a fall fest, Edwin began training M1 on the data he had collected of Fiona, recordings, audio tapes, and the like, so that M1 could be a better caretaker for David while Edwin worked. M1 began copying Fiona to such a degree that Edwin began referring to her as Fiona, even though she looked like this. But it's okay. Even though her endoskeleton is chopped, her digital persona is Mother. But at some point in the process of trying to make M2 a successful copy of the program, Edwin was fully stuck, and M1 was placed inside a mechanical X-Form experimental storage, or specifically her version of it, F10N4, so that her personality and persona could be kept safe while he put M2 into the Mimic endoskeleton, hoping that having a body would be the piece he needed. As far as we're aware, M1 never leaves the F10N4 machine and is still in there to this day. Meanwhile, M2, the thing recently put into the endoskeleton, does begin mimicking somebody, specifically David Murray, Edwin's late son after his death. This puts Edwin over the edge, and through his grief he beats the Mimic senselessly and breaks its legs. But in due time it gets Edwin killed and takes over Murray's costume manor, killing anybody who enters, and as far as we're aware, it's still in that endoskeleton to this day, the Mimic endoskeleton we see at the end of Ruin. And finally, I believe that William Afton and Fazbear Entertainment, when they collected all of Murray costume Costume Manor's assets, William found M1 and M2 in the basement after the first ending. When he did so, he learned about the Mimic and promised to help Fiona make M2 into David again, but first, to practice learning how the Mimic even works, he took a copy of the Mimic schematics and tried to replicate himself with it, essentially making M3. The reasons being twofold. One, he genuinely wanted to learn how the Mimic works, but two, he's seeing in front of himself a form of immortality. Fiona the human is dead, but in a way her personality lives on through M1. So if his body should ever fail, M3 could continue his legacy. As far as we're aware, the Mimic schematics are held in the data diver, so that's where I think M3 would have ended up. And it's that very data diver that I think is scanned into Help Wanted, which eventually forms this persona, who I'm going to try to convince people to call Malhair, with that 3 on the end. M3, Malhair. Malhair's goal is to re-enter the real world to continue William Afton's legacy, but to do so it needs a suitable body. It tried a few humans, but that never quite worked, but in its memory banks, that Mimic endoskeleton should still be in the basement. So that brings us to Security Breach. M1 is still lingering around and still wants to reset M2 into being David so she can have her son back, but Malhair wants that same Mimic endoskeleton for itself, so it can enter the real world and continue William Afton's experiments. So if both of them want this weird thing in the basement, what exactly is it? So again, what is that weird thing in the basement? Well, sometimes the simplest answer is the right solution. And if in Secret of the Mimic we find out that this pizzeria somehow existed way before Security Breach's Pizzaplex was ever built, but it was the same building, and in one of the Secret of the Mimic endings, the Mimic is in that building, and in Ruin, there's a Mimic endoskeleton in the same building, I think it's just safe to assume that's the Mimic. Sometimes a square is a square. But then what about the new parts of the endoskeleton? These two models are completely different. Well, we get a whole section in Secret of the Mimic dedicated to showing how Murray's Costume Manor would reuse animatronics and repair them. Something that the Mimic could have learned. Not to mention, in the book, the Mimic is known for being able to repair itself with other pieces of technology. So the idea that the Mimic, over time as parts of it started to decay, replaced older parts with newer parts is not only implied, but frankly directly intended. So if that is the Mimic, then that is the body that M1 and Malhair are vying over. They've been spending years battling to get access to this endoskeleton. But if so, there's one issue. The last time we saw the Mimic, M2 was still inside of it, and anytime anybody got close to it, it would try to kill them. So what happens now, all the way later in Ruin when we get close to it? Oh, it tried to kill us. So M2 is probably still in there. If we know the origins and goals of the warring factions vying for the body of the Mimic, why don't we know practically anything about M2's wants or goals? We know M1 wants the Mimic to be David. We know Malhair wants the Mimic to be William Afton. But what does M2 want the Mimic to be? M2 is an interesting character. A lot of people like to assume that it's the Mimic replicating David, much like M1 is the Mimic replicating Fiona. But that's not quite true, is it? I mean, I would hope it's not quite true, otherwise this is how David typically acts. M2 was originally meant to be a sellable version of the Mimic, something that may have saved Murray's Costume Manor from ruin. The original idea of the Mimic, a program and suit that could put on any costume and become any character with little training. Oh, are you all done? Oh, I'll just put him in the background. Again, cat tower eventually. But not only was Edwin struggling to replicate the success of M1, eventually his son David dies, which sends him into a crisis. Him and M1. At this point in the timeline, M1's main directive is to take care of a child, and she no longer has one. So she begins pressuring Edwin into making M2 into a copy of David. After all, M2 is a copy of M1's own programming, and he made M1 a copy of Fiona, so in a way, this would be the truest son she could ever have. Now, to the extent that Edwin actually went along with this is unclear. We have an audio log saying that it's not right and he wouldn't be David, which makes it sound like Edwin never attempted it at all. But then we have another audio log of Edwin reacting to M2 copying David and having that whole fit that destroys the Mimic. So clearly it began copying David, which I would assume implies that Edwin began the process and maybe backpedaled when he began to realize how deranged all of this is. But it is admittedly unclear. For all we know, M1 might have been feeding M2 that information. But regardless, M2 does eventually begin mimicking David Murray. And filled with grief, in response, Edwin beats the Mimic senselessly to the point where its legs are broken. But for this, M2 sabotages Edwin's office and gets it blown up. In doing so, Edwin is trapped in the rubble and M2 refuses to help, effectively, likely, killing Edwin Murray. And once Edwin's out of the way, M2 has free reign over the entire factory and can kill anyone who enters. But it's in that moment of killing Edwin Murray that we hear M2 mimicking Edwin to mock him directly for the failures in his life.
Call for help! Daddy's busy, buddy. Why don't you go outside and play?
So we know what it's doing in Secret of the Mimic, and when we cut to Ruin, M2 is kind of doing the thing it always has. It's now mimicking Gregory to trick somebody to let it out, and once it's out, it immediately goes to kill Cassie. So if this is M2, whose side is it on? Does it want to be turned into William Afton, or does it want to be reset and become David like it was originally meant to be? Well, let's look at its actions. The whole goal of Secret of the Mimic is that we have to obtain the original Mimic schematics to reset M2 to turn it into David. It's what we see in the secret ending. Because according to M1, right now, M2 is just a mindless agent of violence and chaos, lashing out at anything nearby, and it has no rational thought. In the confrontation in the pizzeria, M1 even says if we shut off power and trap us both down here with M2, it will not only kill Arnold, but it'll kill M1 too. It'll kill everyone. But is M2 really just a mindless killer? I don't think so. Look at the second ending of this game, when we escape Murray's costume manor with a copy of the Mimic schematics in tow, and the Mimic is chasing us down trying to crash our vehicle. Once we're trapped under the van, we're no longer a threat, and the moment we're not, the Mimic stops hunting us. It lifts the van, it looks like it's about to kill us, but all it does is take the data diver, the thing holding the Mimic schematics, and walks away. It leaves us be. It's almost like that's the only thing it wants in that moment. If you think about it, the Mimic could have left the facility at any time. Sure, it would be hard to blend into human society as an endoskeleton, but it doesn't have to hang around this factory. It keeps killing everyone that enters, but if it doesn't want to be captured, it can just leave. We see it leave in multiple endings. There's nothing keeping it here, but it doesn't. It stays in Murray's costume manor, and it kills any intruder that enters. So why? Well, as far as we're aware, every intruder since M2 was set loose was someone trying to reset it. Either it was a Fazbear employee trying to claim it for Fazbear and claim the Mimic schematics, or it was something listening to M1, and in doing so would give the Mimic schematics to M1, who would then give it to Edwin, who would then reset M2. But in this ending, the second ending of the game, all of Murray's costume manor and the original mansion are seemingly burned to the ground. They're fully on fire when we leave. I can assume the fire kept going. So the only workable copy of the Mimic schematics now is in the data diver. And once the Mimic gets that, and the factory is burnt down, it then wanders off into the woods to do who knows what. Something it could have done all along. All it has to do is destroy this last copy of the Mimic schematics, and M2 would never be under threat of being reset into David again. And it clearly does not want to be turned into David. Look at the secret ending. This thing is fighting tooth and nail against its own programming and its own structure just to stop us from resetting it. Whatever M2 is, it doesn't want to be turned into David. So then, what about being the next William Afton? Well, that's not a great option either. Throughout the entirety of Ruin, we see Helpy, the entity inside the mask, who I believe is Malhair, but that argument is a theory for another day, manipulating Cassie to get to the bottom of the pizzeria to set the Mimic free. But with the context of this theory, what is actually going on here? Well, like when M2 was inputted into the Mimic in the first place, I think they need to get the original program out of the Mimic endoskeleton to make room for the new iteration. M1 was put into a Mexis console to make room for M2, and now they need to get M2 out to make room for Malhair. I think the most likely setup for Ruin is that in attempting this, they tried to utilize the MXE console that M1 is not in. Secret of the Mimic tells us there's at least two. But when they activated it, it turned on Malhair. After all, the MXES console is just built to obtain a Mimic schematic, and Malhair is a Mimic schematic. So instead of yoinking M2 out of the Mimic endoskeleton, it instead chased Malhair and the rest of his followers out of the Pizzaplex to keep his programming safe. Think about it. This MXES entity in Ruin only goes after you when you're wearing the mask, something that has the Mimic inside of it. I think that by activating this console, they essentially set themselves up for failure and gave themselves a brand new enemy to worry about. So now Malhair needs a human to get past Cradle.exe to lead them in. It's why Cassie's mind isn't taken over at the beginning of the game. Vanny can't get too close because Vanny has a Mimic in her brain. And frankly, Vanessa's probably free by the time of Ruin anyway. He needs a human to go down there to then put himself into the Mimic Endo. So Cassie's manipulated to get all the way down deep into the pizzeria and disable the MXES console to shut off Cradle.exe. And suddenly, Malhair is out of that threat. But now that we can't use that, the new plan is just to overwhelm M2, maybe short out the program or shunt it out by force when the mask is put on. So Malhair just has Cassie free the Mimic so it can attempt to take over its body. And the Mimic's very first objective? Kill Cassie immediately. Just like with M1. M2, even though it was working with Malhair to free itself, refuses to let Malhair take over its body. It will not be changed by outside forces, and it will kill to do so. So if it's neither M1 or M3, what does M2 want? The Tales of the Pizzaplex books are pretty solidly proven to not take place in the continuity of the games after Secret of the Mimic, but I still think, like most FNAF books, they're very important to know the themes and ideas of the world that we're theorizing in. They're great background context for any theory you could make. And one idea that is constantly brought up in Tales from the Pizzaplex but never truly goes anywhere is sort of an inverse of the themes of Five Nights at Freddy's up until this point. Up until now, Five Nights at Freddy's as a franchise was about people becoming machines, children possessing animatronics, the whole concept of Springtrap, even to an extent Ennard wearing Michael. It's a human being replaced with a robot. But repeatedly in Tales from the Pizzaplex, there are themes of robots trying to become human. The other way around. A perfect example is this story, Nexie. Now, granted, the Nexie doll doesn't look like this. I've always had beef with this art. This is much too cutesy. Nexie is more accurately described as if the Cynthia doll from the Rugrats was bought by Sid from Toy Story. Regardless, in the story Nexie, the main character is tricked by her buddytronic, Nexie, to the point where this robotic doll knocks out the main character, kills her, and wears her skin to go to school like a human. Obviously, people find out immediately and they're horrified, but it's still a robot attempting to become human. We see this in B7 too, where the robotic personality of Billy, or B7, is its own robot, but it's still attempting to latch onto a human host and become human again. We even see this, unfortunately, in the Flesh, where a digital Springtrap escapes into the real world through the body of its creator. This theme appears over and over again in Tales from the Pizzaplex, but there's never really a payoff with the idea, it just keeps reinforcing it. Well, I think that's because the payoff is the games themselves. Because I think the idea of a robot wanting to become human is the story of M2. The creation of M2 is messy. By the time it's been freed of Edwin, it's a mishmash of a lot of different characters. A little bit of David, a little bit of Edwin, a little bit of Monica on my side. It's everyone that we've seen so far. Throughout the game, it constantly switches between characters and voices, but more than what it would be initially programmed for, to the point where at the end of the game, when it puts on a pile of scrap, it just starts pulling random lines from random characters it knows in a weird combined voice. It even does this in the final chase when it's not wearing anything. And by the time of Ruin, this voice has been honed and refined to the point that it can still replicate voices like we see it do with Gregory, but it almost has its own voice once it's able to drop the facade. The Mimic program is built to see things and replicate them, but M2 has been shown to remix those things, combine them, separate them into pieces, use them for its own purposes. In a way, M2 is filtering its environment and creating new things with it. In a way, more than a robot, M2 is acting like a human, something that learns from its environment and creates new combinations with the things it knows. M1 and Malhair were specifically trained to mimic exactly one person. M1 mimicked Fiona so well that Edwin started referring to her as Fiona. Looking at Malhair and how he acts in Help Wanted, this is very clearly a robotic replica of William Afton. And being so straightforward, I think it leaves the choices and logic of M1 and M3 as much more robotic than M2. These two very much feel like robots carrying out the will of what they were programmed to do. But M2 never got that chance to be specifically trained. It may have started out being trained on David's data, but very quickly was beat out of doing so. From then on, M2 begins making its own persona, using the snark of copying Edwin against him, taking lines from different characters and mixing them together. By the point of Ruin in the timeline, M2 is very much its own person. It's becoming more human by the day, and resetting M2 or forcing it out of its body would be effectively killing it. If this program has learned and evolved so much that it's acting human, changing it to its original schematics would be like wiping its brain. At the end of the day, M2 is acting like a scared animal, begging to be freed and to be left alone, for no one to change it and for no one to be able to change it. And it's strong enough to protect itself until one day that might become a reality. So that's the premise. I think that M2 doesn't want to be William Afton and doesn't want to be reset into David. M2 wants to be itself. It already is, it just needs the freedom to be able to do that, and it's willing to kill to find it. But let me know what you think in the comments below. I think this is showing us that moving forward, the real trick to the Mimic is going to be letting it go, and we'll see what happens after. In the meantime, again, if you missed MimicCustody, it really goes along with this theory, so you should go watch that right now. I'm really proud of it. It's right here. If you want your fan art featured on the channel, make sure to share it with #ToastArt. A huge thank you to the best channel members, the Dough Risers, and thanks again to Fume for sponsoring today's video. And until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.